All right, I'm with Edward Doyle-Gillespie. Ed, that's the last time I'm going to talk to the podcast because I like just hanging out with you, so I just want to chat. Um,
That's
so we met at a book event at a bar where we were selling books at a bar.
right.
Yeah. And then
How
we've
about we
been,
go with
yeah,
that?
and we've been in touch ever since because, I think we've only hung out like 3 times, but every time we have, I've really enjoyed
Yeah,
hanging
so
out
have
with
I.
you. Yeah. So I was like, man, I just want an excuse to hang out with Ed. So I have a
Absolutely.
podcast. I can do that. Um, I don't even know how to introduce you, man. You've been a teacher. You have multiple degrees. You were a police officer for a little while.
I'm still
Um,
I'm still doing that gig. I'm still
you're still doing the police officer. Yeah.
yeah.
You're a poet. Um, you've written stories. Yeah. How do you introduce yourself? That's a better way to ask.
It's funny. I was we were just in Australia this summer, and I found that people always, "Hey, hi, who are you? Where are you from? What do you do?" And you often go short form and just, I'm a police officer. All right, mate. Oh yeah, yeah. You ever seen anyone get shot? I'm like, oh God.
Yeah.
And my wife reminded me, she says, you do a lot of other things too. And so I actually started telling people I'm a teacher and that I'm a writer because I've continued to teach and I've
Yeah.
continued, and I think there's a lot more I'd rather discuss based around that milieu, you know. So I'll have to start with that, but it's great to be able to communicate with people on lots of different levels. I like martial arts, and I had some great conversations about martial arts, and I had some great historical conversations with some people down there. That was a lot of fun.
That's so
But
cool.
yeah,
Yeah, it's funny. That question is really geared toward you are defined by a single job that you do your whole life,
right,
and that
right.
definitely doesn't describe you. You far more hit the Renaissance man
Oh,
characteristic of like, master of multiple things. Yeah. That
yeah.
somehow fit together, but probably shouldn't. Yeah. So let's talk about your writing.
Yeah.
Where talk to me about your writing journey and like what it's been like, if you could chunk it into like some phases for us, that'd be
Wow,
awesome.
yeah. It's funny. My mother was an English teacher. My dad was a history teacher, and they used to laugh that I was writing stories before I could actually write. And so we had those little blue exam books around the house. People might remember those. For people of a certain age, might remember taking your exams in the little blue books. And we had those all over the house, and so I would take those and scribble in them. So there was, the nebulous introduction stage, and I did a lot more writing fiction, like pulp fiction, war fiction, and stuff when I was going through my high testosterone adolescent age. But poetry was always there, and mom taught poetry a lot and
Nice.
recited poetry a lot, and so I think that I started becoming more focused. Like I started getting it published, like in the school magazine and stuff when I was in college and undergrad. I was studying history. I went to
Hmm.
George Washington. Um, Recently, I think it's funny. I look at work that I did, say, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and very Dionysian work. It was very, it was very blunt and it was very Dionysian, and I got kudos for it, so I suspect it had some merit to it. But I think I wrote very instinctually, and I think over time I've become more precise,
Hmm.
more school, more mindful of how of what I want to present. Um, I think also kind of coming to grips with a lot of those Dionysian impulses, got them reined in to the point where I could really communicate them. Um, it's often there's often that question. It's funny, you can look at so many different literary philosophers. I mean, I read um, Annie's Nin on the modern novel, and I read, recently I was read Nietzsche and a few different. The whole thing is always like, how do you get from that impulse, right, that the writer has through the mechanical motion of putting it into words and then making it something accessible?
Yeah.
and making it accessible. And I mean, this is I remember talking to someone. She sent a poem to me, and I said, "This is good. Now here's where I would tighten it up." He's just like, "No, no, I have to keep that." I said, "Well, here's where I didn't quite. No, no, I have to keep that." And so I was doing poetry with kids when I taught English at Baltimore Friends. I said, "Well, let's take a look at this poem, read it." And they were like, "This is trash. What is this?" It's not trash, but clearly you have a hard time understanding what this person is saying. So that then leads us down another path where, T.S. Eliot said in the 20th century, poetry has to be difficult. But what does difficulty mean, right? It's like it.
Oh, that's my problem with poetry. Is that I struggle with it so much. Yeah. Sorry. Go
Yeah.
ahead. What does
No, it's
difficult
like,
mean?
well,
Is a
here's
great
the thing
question.
though. It's like, is it a cipher? Right? I mean, I often think of it as a type of cipher where it's like if you have like lexical, I think that's one thing that's really
That's
changed
interesting.
a lot
Yeah.
my poetry recently is the lexical difficulty. I've allowed myself to explore more lexical difficulty because that's an exchange between the writer and the receiver that, okay, I'm going to challenge you to figure out what I'm talking about here. Now go back and take a look at it again.
Yeah. What does that
Um,
difficulty look like? Like, are you just allowing yourself less grammatical structure, or is it like an image?
oh, well, see, that's the thing. I think, I find that my grammatical structure has become more precise and more,
Mm,
I think everyone goes through that, like, that E. Cummings all the way maybe to Ginsburg type, man, I'm just writing,
yeah.
but
Just words on a page and
I'm
weird.
gonna
Yeah.
be, bro,
Yeah. My
and
dad
then
used to love Keel Gibran. And
oh,
we had shelves full of Keel Gibran, and I used to like try to read them every once in a while. And then I found out that a lot of times he was on drugs. And I was like, yeah, this feels like it feels like he's
right,
on drugs. Yeah.
right. But speaking in terms of like prose, I remember being an undergrad, and you always have that book that you're reading alongside everything else you're doing for classes. So I picked up Naked Lunch. And halfway through, I was like, what the hell is this? I mean, what is going on?
It's true. It's not limited to poetry, is it? Just
No,
get you
what
some
the
good
hell
Ulysses in there, and you're like, what is happening in this book?
is happening here? And I finally met someone many years later. She said, "Oh, I knew Ginsburg. I knew Burroughs." And, oh, did you really? Yeah. She said, "Oh, Burroughs was just crazy. He was whacked out on drugs. He was crazy." Like, okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. So wait,
but
go back to the lexical
right, so lexical
exploration you're doing.
difficulty. Right. So the idea is their content, right? Like for instance, I did a poem about it's the speaker is a guy. He's talking to this woman who's a bit of a scholar, and they're very intimate. But she has been contemplating the Zong massacre, and so from my kind of my bailiwick of history came the idea of this slave massacre,
Mm,
and he starts putting it into feminist terms. And so a friend of mine read it, and he's like, okay. So the first time he read through it, as often happens, you just have that sensory
yeah,
perception,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay. And so what I found, and not to diverge too much, but it's like a lot of the stuff I initially wrote was very much like Artaud's theater of cruelty type stuff, where it's like you
I
read
don't
it.
know that.
So he was the French playwright. He was an opium and had all sorts of mental problems. But his thing was that theater, that art should not go to the intellect. It should be something that just hits you in the gut.
Okay.
And so you can get stuck there. Like I think so. Of the poems I wrote were very cathartic. They were about stuff I've seen with police work, and so they're very cathartic, and they were very much like theater of cruelty. But so my friend said, okay, so I read this first sensory, I had this sensory read, and there's sensual images. There's this image of
Mm,
this woman kind of doing up her hair and stuff. And but he said I had no clue what the Zong massacre was. So he went through and he did some research, came
yeah.
back to it again. So the Zong massacre was a case. The Zong was a slave ship, and on its way to the West Indies, it was struck by a storm, and it was off course. They were taking on water.
Mm,
So they figured, well, there's not enough food and water for people who are off course. We're kind of thinking we need to get rid of the ballast. So they threw the slaves off.
Hmm.
And when it came up in court, it came up in insurance court, not as murder.
Yeah.
Um, and so, after doing some research, he went back and read it. So, to me, I think often the lexical difficulty of the poem, the content, is an invitation to get deeper into the piece, deeper into the thinking.
Hmm.
But still, it can't be something that's so binary and bifurcated. Like, well, it means this or it means that. It's like, okay, what is the poet saying about this thing?
Yeah.
Because I
So
don't get. Mhm.
let me see if I get you. You're saying that the complexity of the poem. So this is exactly what I wanted to do today, was talk poetry with you, because I'm just going to confess up. You know this about me. I think we've talked about it before. I am a poet illiterate. I am, and I've never tried to write poetry, nor do I have lyricism in my bones. But what I hear you, so this is good, because this is why I was like, if I'm gonna figure out poetry, I need to talk to Ed. So what I hear you saying is that right now you're kind of living in a place where the complexity of the imagery forces the recipient, the reader, into a um, more abstract central place where they have to explore the meaning
Mm.
in kind of a
Right.
mosaic way. Is that what you're, is that?
Yeah, and I think it's very much like you end up with, okay, where did this hit me at first? It's a lot like, I mean, not to use some sort of very pretentious analogy, but like when you drink some wine, swirl it, drink some more, swirl it, you start getting different levels of complexity and flavor. And so it's like you can
Gotcha.
go from that moment of just the images. Hey, I like the rhythm of those words. Then let me read it through again. Are there pieces of information in here that I
Mm,
didn't really understand, that I didn't really get, or why was this here and that there? Um, I think there's a piece called the naming of parts, about soldiers putting together their rifles, and
mm,
they don't have all the pieces. You have to kind of read it through once or twice. It's like, oh, they don't have all of the pieces of the rifles. Oh, it shows they're being trained very quickly. You know, um,
mm.
so like my friend said, okay, after I read, so then he said, well, after I read what the Zong massacre was, and I went back. So it's this very, this sensuous scene of this man and woman. They're in bed and they're talking, and she's very coquettish, and she's describing a massacre, people being drowned, and I know that uh, the new critics. I mean, I mean, not that I'm in any way enamored of the new critic mindset. These are the people that gave us Gone with the Wind. But I mean,
Okay.
but they but they
Thank you for
said that.
defining that, because my next question was going to be like, hey, Ed, tell me who the new critics are. I don't know.
And it's funny because they would fit very well into the culture war
Hmm.
that is going on right now, because their thing was, don't take a piece of poetry and analyze it in any any social context aside from what's presented to you right in that poem.
Huh. Okay.
So, right.
Yeah.
So, because their big thing was, already they were saying there were too many changes taking place in the world. Most of them were Southern white men,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
they were in like the 30s and 40s.
Yeah. That
And
makes sense to me. Yeah.
they were already saying there are too many changes taking place. This isn't good for us. And so
Yeah.
the big thing was, so at the same time that they didn't want to acknowledge social context, they wanted to make it all about a social context, but it theirs.
Yeah.
And so,
They just want to limit social context. We want
right,
social
right,
context, just the
right,
social
exactly.
context we want. Yeah.
Exactly. He said the good context. But given that, still, I did appreciate, you can take bits and pieces of so many different philosophies and understanding
Yeah.
anything. And I mean, I do like what they said about tension. And I think that I naturally do go to tension when I write poetry. I think, um, there's
What does it mean to go to tension?
so if you have two kind of diametrically opposed images,
Yeah.
language that doesn't seem to fit, and
Like
yet
a
there's a
soft rock.
exactly.
Okay.
Someone said to me the other day, I read a piece for them, and he said, "Wow, that was really beautiful till you got to the line about axe handles. And so, could I read a piece for you real
Yeah,
fast?
man.
Or
Yeah, yeah. Bring it. I love it. Let's do it.
sure. All right, let's see here.
Now, is this one you wrote, or is this one somebody else wrote?
Yeah, so this is one that I wrote.
Nice.
This
I
is
love it.
from my book Aerial Act. So this is
Hmm.
one of my collections. I was supposed to launch this the day we went into quarantine. Um,
Really? Oh,
yeah, at the Ivy bookstore. And
oh man.
we were kind of calling back and forth. And of course I was, yeah, we're fine. Let's go ahead with it. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know. They're
Yeah.
talking about it.
And you
So
have
this
four
is
collections, right?
right. So I've
Yeah.
got
Sorry, I'm getting
unsigned.
you and I just took off talking about poetry, so I'm
Oh,
gonna force your
sure.
history into here a little bit. You got four collections.
Right, so Aerial Act,
Yeah.
one. Socorro Prophecy.
Yeah.
All right. These are my most recent ones. This is Gentrifying the Plague House.
Yeah. Those are the
And this
two I
is
have.
right. This is Father of the Red Grotto Used Bookstore,
Yeah. Okay.
which is and they're all fun to read, fun to write. It was great.
They are fun to read.
This is
I've loved two of them, and I don't like poetry, and so I've read
the,
two of them, and
oh,
so
thank
I'm
you.
learning, man. I'm learning. Okay, so but
That's what we're
sorry.
doing.
Yeah, back to the axe handle and tension.
No, no problem. Let me see. So yeah, let's see what we can pick out here. Um, so a little bit of history in this, and a little bit of let me see here. Just had it. Here it is. So this is called "The River Had a Part in It." The river introduced them one to the other. It took communion from them, took them apart as it would topsoil after a rain, and washed their stories downstream. This was how they knew one another when the time for leaving came. This was how the one who had been broken with axe handles, folded and packed away in the dirt of an earthen dam for speaking out of turn, heard the story of the child who was weighed down with a cotton gin wheel and tossed from the skiff that the old men used for fishing. The river introduced them and was gracious and kind as it mingled them, because this was the South, and no one should travel alone through the weeping of the Gulf, the blindness of the mud, and out to the freedom of the ocean's salt.
Damn. Okay, so let me try to do this. I loved at the opening, and Ed, forgive me, man. I'm new to poetry. I love at the opening how you're using the river metaphor as a dividing metaphor.
Mm.
But then when you get to the axe handle and you start in bringing in more present slavery images, the river metaphor, the dividing actually becomes more of a churning, where people are brought together through the suffering as they travel through this river that originally separated them. Is that
Wow, yeah.
how am I?
So
How am I doing,
really,
man?
I mean, so here, yeah, I mean, it's that's let's see. Now here's the thing, and I believe very much in what Roland Barthes said in Killing the Author, that it's I mean, in that, well, I think that essay is what, 8 pages long,
Yeah,
where
yeah, it's a good essay though.
it's really good.
Yeah.
It's really good. And I mean, I love that line at the very end where he says the death of the author is the birth of the reader, where
Oh,
it's like imperative not to squelch. See, I like what you got about division and combination. That's really pretty cool. And yeah, I mean, this came to me because in so many tales of the violent atavistic South, rivers played a role in it, whether it was drowning people or getting rid of bodies or attempts to escape.
yeah,
Um, the
yeah.
method by which people were sold to the lower South. And this is, slavery and beyond. And so I thought particularly about a few different things came to mind. One was how when remember they were looking for Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, the three civil rights workers that went
Yeah.
missing, and they found them in an earthen dam.
Hmm.
They found their bodies in a dam. I've heard from more than one source. Um, I've read it. I saw it in a documentary. She's fine. that searchers found, I think, like a dozen other bodies while they were looking for them. Um, they found like a dozen other people.
Mm.
And what's interesting is how rivers, so the river is used almost like a murder weapon. It's used as part of the crime, and the indifference or even the benevolence of the river, in that it gives them a final community.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah, it
know,
brings them together. Well, and there's that image of like as it's used as a weapon, and like, there's also like the harkening of just water calls back to the initial slave journey and separation. But
mm,
it also played such a strong role in those escape gospel songs that were used as like communication tools, like as I go down to the river to pray, wondering about the
mhm,
good old day, those songs that like were used as hope. The river's almost recaptured, which is what I
yeah,
see you doing in your poem too, that like recapturing of what it
mhm.
is. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Now, see, I think that's part of the beauty of poetry, that it's a launching pad for your understanding, because everyone has their own lexical background as well. And so
Mm,
the launching of that, that's great. I mean, that's wow. And
yeah,
I mean, so
man. Yeah. So I think how is let me ask this instead of just circling around that. What is do you think, because you've also written narrative,
Mhm.
how has your poetry impacted your narrative writing?
It's funny. I'm working on a novel now, and it's the first draft is done. I'm writing my way through it,
Mhm.
and I'm finding that I'm letting myself run with taking poetic license and having poetic methodology with it. So like I'll do repetition a lot
Mm, okay.
as a point, which I think is a lot of fun. I'll use repetition. I will use alliteration at times. So there, you can't, one will definitely influence the other. And I also, I think I've allowed myself to play with bigger images, allowed myself to use language in a bigger way, I think. Um,
Yeah, I think something that I noticed talking to you, um, that I find very attractive about your brain is that you're kind of looking for poetry everywhere.
mm,
Um, I've heard you even talk about like, real trauma that you've experienced and seen, and you're still kind of finding the metaphor in it. Does that make sense?
it's, it's funny. Yes, and let me say it this way. I had an experience recently with flashbacks. And
Hmm.
when I was growing up, a kid in the 80s, whenever I'd meet a Vietnam vet, it's like, oh my God, my God. Some of them were, some would talk about it.
Yeah, yeah.
They'll say, well, I've had flashbacks. And to me, a flashback was a bad memory.
Hmm.
Now that I've had them, I understand it's like you're suddenly on a roller coaster.
Yeah.
And so I've had that experience where like literally my daughter has asked me a question about something I've experienced, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And for a moment I'm not there.
Hmm.
Likewise, there are moments that I've seen, there are moments I've had that will just distill themselves. Horrible things are taking place. And part of me is saying, wow, there's a metaphor in this. You better keep hold of this. Wow. You know. And I've had quite a few of those. So likewise, it's like there was nothing conscious. It wasn't like I said, I'm going to take this and turn it into an allegory for that. It's just
Hmm.
like
Yeah, yeah.
it just kind of said to me, yeah, this is what you need to do. And so yeah, but I've had situations where like, um had someone like look me in the eye as they died, or reach out for me as they died, or ask me to kill them. I've had that twice where people struggling with addiction have just said, officer, if you just, one guy was very precise. He said, if you just put it behind my ear, no one's going to care. And I could feel that doing something to me. And it was almost like, I'm not. particularly spiritual person, but it was like it was that moment just said you need to use that.
Hmm.
This is what you need to write. And I still have some of those I'm mulling over, and what I'm going to do with them. Um, we had a yeah um, yeah, I'm still mulling a lot of that over, but yes, it's it has given itself to me very quickly as a way to deal with trauma.
Yeah. And I hear you saying that it kind of comes from a guttural place.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, when I used to study theology and I could read Hebrew, I don't read ancient Hebrew anymore, but when I used to be able to, they used to
Oh,
say, like, we use the metaphor of like the heart, like we talk about, like, people, you have my heart or you broke my heart.
mm,
The ancient prophets used to talk about the splankna, or the gut. It came from your stomach, and so the
wow.
seat of emotion was your stomach.
And say it again. How do you say it?
I think it was splankna, if I remember right, but it's been a
Smack.
long time. Yeah, it's like the gut or the stomach. It's like that, like, that's kind of what I feel. Even when you're talking about like writing more historic based poetry,
Mhm.
would you say that it starts at an emotional place, or does it start at an image place, or is there a law to that, or is it just like, does it just come how it comes?
It's a little bit of all that because I may have. I think it's always been very difficult for me to study history without like an empathetic bend to it.
Hmm,
Um,
yeah.
so I often wonder, wow, I wonder what that felt like. I wonder how that person dealt with that. Um, I had a, I was teaching Vietnam War, and we had some Vietnam vets came in. I mean, they said, "Oh, can we bring some stuff into the room?" I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." They brought everything, ammo cans, captured flags. Do you want to leave this here? Oh, yeah. They said, "This is part of our therapy." They said, "This is part of our therapy, is talking to kids and showing them this stuff." And we outfitted one of the boys in a full kit
Hmm,
that he would have worn. This is an eighth grader, but we
wow.
outfitted him the full kit, and he was just like, "Oh my gosh, I can't breathe." So it was like it was just so heavy. But I wanted them to feel it.
Hmm,
I think often we often put, once again, going to that Apollyon Dionysian dichotomy, we often put history in that Apollyon camp of facts and figures and
yeah.
places and dates. And look at like, what do you think this felt? This is why I used music a lot when I taught history. I used music, I used art, I used poetry
Hmm,
because we had to understand how people felt about a lot of these things.
yeah.
And so a lot of it, and then as we see with, it's a great example. We see what's going on now with social politics, where we're talking a lot about feelings, how people felt, what people. It wasn't just a matter of, well, slavery took place here, and this is what happened. But it's not the fact that it happened, but the debate is over whether it caused human suffering
Yeah.
and how we're going to judge the people that did it.
Yeah.
Not just a matter of, well, it existed between this date and this date, but the way Native Americans were treated in the Trail of Tears. Oh, well, they should have known. Well, no, it's about how people felt and how you felt about the person that did it.
Yeah. And it's a weird thing because it becomes a, you know, almost discussion of what was the amount of suffering.
Right.
Like, we've come to a place where,
Right.
like,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
there was
Yeah.
suffering that happened, but what was the extent?
Right.
It's like,
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
you're saying,
We
like,
didn't suffer enough for us to really care about it.
yeah,
That
yeah,
I mean, I was someone who I thought of as a very well-educated person, with whom I went to undergrad, said, well, lots of them are treated very well. I mean, and I've heard someone. So I was very surprised too about someone who I really respected. Again, who said,
yeah,
I just don't think that many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. I just, and I said, well, here's how it worked. since the mechanics of it seem to be, it's not enough just to absorb it and say, you know what, this happened, and this is something I need to learn about human nature.
Yeah, and I think going back to poetry, I think that may be part of what's been difficult for me with it is that sometimes I don't know what to do with those feelings.
Mhm.
Like, so after we did Books and Brews, I'd read some of your poetry and was talking to you. I was in a Barnes and Noble, the one
Mhm.
out in White Marsh, and I was walking around and I was thinking about poetry, and I was like, man, thinking about Keel Gibran and like trying to live because I idolized my father and like anything he read or did, I wanted to read or do. And that was one of the things about that he loved that I couldn't crack. And so kind of walking around and I see on this table the completed works of Langston Hughes. Giant, giant book, man. And I
Mhm.
was like, you know what? The only connection I have to Langston Hughes is a line in the musical Rent. And I was like,
When they're doing the litany.
yeah. And they're like, Langston Hughes. And I'm like, that's really all I know. And so I grabbed it and I bought it. And I've been reading a couple poems a night. Not every, like, there's been some nights I've failed, but almost every night. I'm about halfway through his work now.
Wow.
And there's a lot of his poetry, man, where I read it and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this feeling.
Mm.
There's so much pain and like not all some of it's very joyful, but there's so much like pain and isolation and separation. Just the feeling of rejection and dealing with like the hatred of others. It's
Mhm.
it makes you want to look away at times.
And maybe that's what you need to do with, maybe that's it. Maybe that's just where you need to be with it.
Yeah.
Then the only thing you can do with it. I mean, I know that when I read Maxine Hong Kingston, um, when I've read This Bridge Called My Back, when I've read stuff from feminist writers, women talking about their experiences, um, I know that for me, for me, I become very angry, and
Mm.
uh, I tend to be very absolutist in my thinking. Um, I was sitting we went in Barcelona, and we went to a bar that was popular with the loyalists during the Spanish Civil War, where they would write and drink. And I wrote at one of the tables there, thinking, the idea that they were fighting fascists, it was just very absolutist in my mind that this was my place, and I was almost like a spiritual heir to these people. And so in many cases, all you can do, you can't, it might not be actionable right then and there, but it's part of your makeup now,
Yeah,
right?
and I think the courageous thing is to stare into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're saying, is to sit in it
Right.
and try to live in it. But I wish I were a braver man. Can we say that? It's just it's a tough, yeah, I'm shocked as I read it as to how just because some of his poems are like 10 words
Mm-hmm.
and they
Yeah.
sound at times like a hip hop song.
He did We Cool, right?
Yeah, he did
We
We Cool.
Cool.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, so minimalist and so direct.
Yeah.
And you did. It's that will live forever in that it's long before hip hop was a thing. That rhythm of that,
Yeah.
the the authenticity, that kind of street level authenticity of it, and the nihilism of it.
Yeah.
I think that's the one thing. See, that was the part that really got me about that. This the nihilistic, yeah, here's what we do, and here's what happens, and I'm just embracing it, and here it
Hmm.
is.
Yeah. It's like a stoic hopelessness that's undefeated. See, look at
Mhm.
me being poetic again.
Yeah, you
Stoic,
go.
yeah,
No,
it's like a stoic hopelessness that's undefeated. It's like there's an apathy and a hopelessness to it, but at the same time, there's a persistence in it.
Mhm,
Um,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Someone told me once that a social worker, I was talking to her when we brought in brought in a drug addict. This person was just like covered in their own feces. They've been vomiting and just had, and she said, a problem with humans is that we're too survivable. That
Hmm.
you can put a human in a horrible situation. That some species will just die if they're in the wrong environment, but we just keep on going no matter how bad things get.
Yeah.
Can I read another piece to you from this?
Yeah, please do. Yeah. Yeah, please do.
It kind of gets at what we're talking about here.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is called The Folklore of Sun Showers. The Folklore of Sun Showers. There was a devil's rain falling on the day that you asked me to kill you. I want to say that you begged me to do it, but that would be unfair. That would be me playing dramatic, free and loose with you. I want to say that you came to me on one supplicant knee, Saint Francis of the alleyway, weary of your hypodermic stigmata, and that your only saving grace left in your world lay in the chamber of my automatic. And that would be a lie again. You spoke to me with the calm voice of a supplicant who realized, after this chase down this alleyway, that he had grown ready enough to simply ask, could you put one behind my ear, officer? Ain't nobody gonna care, officer. And the sun was shining, and I could see my reflection in the tribulation of the puddles as the downpour drenched us both, fractured the sunlight, and threatened to wash this city away.
So I again, I like the duality you're using. This is just my first response of like the the pain and tragedy of that moment, but it's not fully about that moment. It's also about you and about when you wrote that, was there a hope of what the reader might glean, or was it just a statement of self-expression, neither being more or less than the other, just you know.
I think the first level was just something. It was something cathartic.
Mhm.
Um, I need to get it. I think the moment was so big, so frightening, so overwhelming, and so it was such. I just seeing someone at their nadir like that
Mhm.
was just so powerful. I was compelled to write it, and then in the process of that, hope that once again that there is a humanizing factor that when someone reads this, when you come away with, you just see two really degraded, human beings. You see human degradation.
Yeah, and I like how you ended in the city, because it is that like the dual degradation, man, I can't say that word. It is that dual defeat that ends up eroding the city, which is, I
Mhm.
think, those last lines. Would you read those last lines again?
Yeah, there you go. And the sun was shining, and I could see my reflection in the tribulation of the puddles as a downpour drenched us both, fractured the sunlight, and threatened to wash the city away.
Yeah, and that, man, that metaphor, that like the sun shining in a downpour, you know, it's such a present. There's just these moments I feel that are like, in life, where you have this equal rage and confusion
Mm-hmm.
that leads to that kind of chaos. Like I one time put in, because I was stupid. I one time put in, I had a guy overdosing, and I put him in my car thinking I could get him to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And he kept trying to go to sleep. And of course, we're like racing to, Hopkins Bayview. And he's falling asleep in the car. It's like he punching him. And he finally like vomits, just starts vomiting all over the car. And I remember I finally got him in there, and he's like, I get him to the hospital, and he's like telling me he's not going to the emergency room. And I literally like grab him by the neck, and I'm like dragging him like you would a child into the emergency. And he's like, they're not going to take, they're just going to make me sit in the waiting room. They're just going to make me sit in the waiting room. And I learned at that point, I was like, well, you always say you're suicidal because then they have to actually like put you somewhere and watch you. And I was like, and he's like, I'm not. I'm like, did you use? He's like, I did. And I'm like, then you are. I was like,
You are.
yeah, you did. You are. You did. You knew this was going to happen. And so, but that moment of like the sun shining in the rain pouring, I felt it when I got back in my car and I'm sitting in his vomit. And all of
I'm
those.
only laughing because I've sat in someone's vomit, and
Yeah,
it's just
you're laughing because you know.
right.
Yeah.
What the
And,
hell is going on?
yeah.
Why am I sitting in
Yeah,
this?
what am I doing in this car? And you have all of the thoughts. You're like, how am I going to get this out of the car before I take it home to my wife? Like, it's just like all of the things. Like, and then like, why did I just call an ambulance? What was I doing? Yeah, and then but it is that moment of chaos that I like there at the end of your poem. That's like the sun was brightly shining, and I was sitting in a downpour, looking down at a puddle at the same time. And it's just the like there's just the chaos of that I really connect to in that line, man.
And I realized I was just listening to you and rereading it, listening to you, that how so much of, I mean, I've been diagnosed with complex PTSD, and so much of it is the balancing, I just living in this liminal space of nothing seen, this surreal is your normal at
Yeah,
this point, you know. And I remember we were training, and one of our training officers, he was showing us some way to get someone out of the car, and he said, this is useful if someone's vomited in your car. And I'm thinking, why would someone vomit in the car? And not long after that, I'm like, oh, so this is how it works. People vomit on you, they spit up blood on you,
yeah.
they throw their feces at you. Okay.
Oh,
And this is my normal. Okay. There was
this is my new normal. This is
this is my
normal
new
now.
normal.
Yeah.
Johnny, the poor Johnny would jump out on lived in Pennsylvania Avenue, and he would just run up and down the street. He had brain damage from taking LSD years before, and he would just run up and down the street and jump in front of cars. He was quite cognizant of what was going on.
Yeah, yeah.
And one day I had to put him in the car because he had been jumping in front of cars too much. And I said, okay, Johnny, we're going to go to the hospital. And I hear this gastrointestinal release in the back of the car. And there was just this moment, this pause. And I said, Johnny, did you just crap in the back of my patrol car? And there's a pause, and I hear, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Okay, Johnny. And I'm thinking, I got to take the car back, got to get some bleach. I finally ended up bringing Clorox with me to the job and like washing out the back of the car. The guys are going to be laughing at me,
oh, man.
the poop patrol car. But then I had to think, yeah, but you know what? This is Johnny's life.
Yeah,
This is how this guy lives now. He's wearing the same clothes he's been wearing for 2 weeks. He
yeah.
defecates in police cars. And it's taken over time. I started to realize the psychic trauma I feel like police officers almost become like the sin eater in
Hmm.
the old English tradition.
Yeah, yeah.
The old, I think you find it in Wales and England
Yeah,
and,
it's the Green Mile story from
right. Yeah,
Stephen King. It's the
right,
like,
right.
I eat your pain, but I feel your pain as I eat it. I have to live.
Exactly.
I take it from you, but I live through it. Yeah.
Right. And I think so. I think a lot of my poetry, I think that was a jumping off point for a lot of my poetry. It was very limbic, very Dionysian, and very cathartic.
Hmm.
Um, I think over time, I ventured into magical realism. It seemed to kind of come very naturally for me. I grew up with a lot of magical realism.
It feels parallel to surrealism. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I think honestly, yeah, Baltimore's a great place for magical
Man,
realism.
it's funny because my time downtown working in like social work circles also pushed me to magical realism.
Oh wow.
Because my first novels are about homeless people who everybody else thinks are delusional and talking to themselves, but they're actually fighting invisible monsters.
Oh, that's so cool.
That was my because
That's so cool.
I'm hanging out with these guys, and I'm like, well, I remember a friend of mine and I we kept trying to help this one guy. He had a car. He kept appearing with his car. I don't think I've ever told this story. He kept appearing with his car, and you'd always ask him, like, he'd show up at the church I was working at, and he'd be like, "Hey, I really need help with this thing," and I'd be like, "Oh, okay," because we had, like, petty cash that we could, like,
Mhm.
get nothing big, but I could definitely always buy somebody a meal, or care for them in some way. Or we had worked with a social service organization that had, like, free hotel vouchers, and then would, like, follow up with you. And so he would always come, and he never wanted any of that. It was always some weird need. It would be like, I need a battery for my car.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, okay, what kind of car is it? He's like, well, I don't know the kind, but if I go look at the batteries, I can tell you. So we go out to Walmart, and we're, like, sitting there, and he's, like, standing in silence looking at this wall of batteries. And I'm like, can I look it up for you? Like, can I help you here? And he's finally, like, leans back and be like, it's that one. And I'm like, okay. So we buy this car battery, and then I drive him to this weird parking lot in the middle of nowhere. And sure enough, there would be a car there. And he'd pop the hood, and sure enough, the battery would fit perfectly. And so the worst stories I understand. I'm like, what is happening? And so my first novels came, the hero of the story is actually based on him. Because we were like, maybe, because we'd say goodbye, we'd, like, make sure he's okay. We're like, can we help you with anything else? He's like, no, I'm gonna go live with my sister in Florida for 4 months, and then he'd be back in 4 months, and, like, I need to go get a cup of this size for this thing. And we're like, what's happening? And so anyway, we would joke about, what if he's actually like a superhero, and this and he can't talk to us because he's, like, actually accomplishing these missions, and he needs a little help, but because he's homeless, he doesn't have any money. So, but, like, that was the birth of my first books.
That is
Was that magical
awesome.
realism world? Yeah.
That is awesome.
Okay. Who's your favorite poet? Can you nail it down to
Oh my
one?
gosh. I don't know if see, it's just you said that I just got this like this barrage of different, I mean, everything from Wilfred Owen to Rita Dove. I mean,
Okay, let me ask it differently. I'm a novelist listening to this, to you and I talk, and
mm,
I'm thinking, like, okay, maybe I need to give poetry a try.
mm.
Where do I start? Besides your books, where do I start? Start with Ed's books. But besides Ed's books, where do I start?
I would so it's funny, Ginsberg.
Okay.
I'm a huge fan of Allen Ginsberg. I met him as well, which was a great experience.
Where'd you meet Ginsberg?
I met him at MICA, actually,
Okay, that's Maryland Institute.
Institute College of Art. So
Yeah.
this was, gosh, let's see, this was almost 30 years ago. Uh, and I carried I carried his stool for him. We sat and talked for a bit. It was really neat, really, really neat meeting him. Diane De Prima,
Okay.
and Rita Dove, Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen. I always liked his work, and got into, since I became part of that fraternity of people that, as they say, go down range. It was,
Yeah.
there are things that I've seen his work, and I go back to it, and
Okay.
it really, really resonates for me. A lot of the World War One poets.
Okay. Nice. That's awesome. Yes, man.
And also, you said Langston Hughes. I'm a big fan. I really like Langston Hughes's work. Like you said, I like the brevity of a lot of his stuff.
It's very brief. I'm finding it, I just picked it up because it happened to be sitting in front of me. But it is, I find it very accessible because it's brief, and then at times I regret its accessibility. At times
Yeah.
I was like, I wish this was harder to understand.
Right. Then I can give myself an out.
Yeah, I could be like, oh, I didn't get it. No,
I
I
didn't
got
get
it. Yeah. Oh man. All right. Well, this has been great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm gonna stop the recording, and I can talk a little bit more.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much.